Welcome to the Mutual Aid Report. The Mutual Aid Report delves into the concept of mutual aid and unpacks its historical significance and its role in local communities by spotlighting individuals who are making a real difference at the grassroots level in the city of Chicago. Let's elevate the profile of mutual aid, shed light on these community-based initiatives, and motivate others to either join or back existing ventures. Let's get right into it.
WLPN-LP Chicago 105.5 FM Lumpen Radio. This is the Mutual Aid Report. Hi, everybody. It's Mario Smith. I hope you're having a great day or a night whenever you happen to be checking us out. Thanks again for listening and participating and helping build our community one day at a time in these very, very interesting times. Today we have the pleasure of having the Kola Nut Collaborative on our program, and the ED of the Kola Nut Collaborative, my friend Michael Strode, is in studio with us today. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Yo, I'm doing very well. I'm just coming off of hosting a workshop and a training over the past 2 hours, and hopped right in the car. Was on the way here, but ultimately I got my meditation in, got enough sleep.
There it is.
Feel well.
There it is. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that we're able to have the Kola Nut Collaborative on today. This show deals with traditional, air quote, mutual aid. The back and forth, the yes, I have a service, yes, you can be part of the service. This is a little bit different when we're talking about mutual aid, not traditional mutual aid. Talk about, well, I think people may need to hear the origin and the story of the Kola Nut first, and then why you chose this very wonderful name for this organization, and then we could talk about the Kola Nut Collaborative.
Absolutely. So, the history and origin of the Kola Nut Collaborative and the name, the Kola Nut specifically. So the Kola Nut Collaborative grows out of a body of work that I started doing with Black Oak Center for Sustainable Renewable Living back in 2009, while my daughter was at Betty Shabazz International Charter. Helped to start up the food hub there, the Healthy Food Hub effort that then migrated over to the quarry before, kind of shifting out to other approaches to food sovereignty. And the Kola Nut Collaborative was something I learned about time banking specifically. There was a Chicago time exchange here, but I learned about, time banking in the way that I was interested in doing it from Chinyere Ote in St. Louis of the Cowrie Collective.
Yes.
And, Chinyere, too, is coming from the Black cultural background, choosing an ancient currency, the Cowrie, for the name of that time bank. And in homage, to the Cowrie Collective and also just kind of being a spinoff of that, I chose the Kola Nut as a different type of ancient currency, right? And so the Kola Nut in West Africa is the symbol of hospitality in Igbo households. You go in, you split the Kola Nut, you share a glass of water, and from that point, you are welcomed into the household. It's a symbol of relationship. It's a symbol of exchange. And so the Kola Nut, for me, is a currency that has both value and values embedded within it. And that is the origin of the name, the Kola Nut Collaborative.
And of course, if you look up Kola Nut on Google or any of the searches, they don't mention any of it. They mention everything except that. It's an FDA-approved nut. It's this, it's that, it's all kinds of things.
Yes.
But that's very important because the idea of that being used as a form of currency in this time and with a collaborative where there are other people who see that and see benefit from using it. And that name, it's perfect, if you ask me. It's a different kind of mutual aid, though. What makes it different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about the time banking and sort of its history. So contemporary time banking, modern time banking, certainly people have been like trading and bartering time over the centuries and, and as sort of human existence, right? But the contemporary time banking movement starts around the 1980s in a very similar sort of maybe similar is challenging, but in a time in the Reagan era, right, where social services were being dramatically cut, and agencies were trying to figure out like how are we going to sustain our programs, and someone named Edgar Kahn, who started initially the Time Dollar Inc., and then later sort of, it's now transitioned to the name timebanks.org, but started time banking as a way to get these agencies to support these agencies in thinking through how they could use the support of communities in order to actually how they could use the people who are actually receiving services and also providing services, a sort of form of asset-based community development. And I'm pretty sure that, Jody Kretzman and, all of the folks at ABCDI say that, John and Jody and Edgar were talking to each other all around. But it's a form of making sure that people who are involved in the solutions are also recipients of services, and that ultimately it's a form of exchange that allows time to be used as a currency. So people can give their time, they can then bank that time, they can then go receive a service with that time. So for instance, I'm very jazzed, I'm eager, excited, I love bike riding, and I'm willing to teach any adult in Chicago who will come to the southeast side of Chicago how to ride a bike. That's my offer. And so if I were in the time bank banking that service, I could bank 2 hours of my time when I showed someone how to ride a bike, and then I could take that 2 hours of time and ask someone to come over and help me move things around in my garage or mount this mailbox that I just purchased to the front of my house. So that's what time banking is meant to do. It's meant to connect communities in a network of reciprocal exchange.
Why haven't we seen that used more, particularly in cities like Chicago, where there is a network of folks who collaborate and get together and talk about, okay, we need to farm, we need to talk about how these schools are going to work, things like that. Why haven't we used time banking before?
Time banking, I would say, is one of those sort of complex tools, right? So even just to explain the idea, it took me a while to arrive at the explanation to you today, right? So I admit that, it's a complex idea to wrap your head around. Yeah. And even when we tried to implement time banking in the Healthy Food Hub, trying to both teach people about the food system, teach people how to run the food hub, and then teach people about this idea of trading their time were too many things to try to show folks in one setting. So time banking is an idea that takes a little while to get landed. And I'll admit, even in some of the current contemporary partnerships that I'm having now with the Kola Nut Collaborative, there are people that I've been talking to for 10 years who are finally coming around to this idea. Certainly I've been in conversations with Erica Allen at Urban Growers Collective about how their workshops might be time bankable. And, it just takes a while, one, to get your mind wrapped around the idea, to think about how to introduce this idea to the populations that you serve, and then ultimately to figure out how to embed this idea in the type of programming and the approach to nonprofits that people are using now.
And we were talking before we came on the air about what, and God knows, I wish it would have turned out differently and that the system would have been there. But Amara Enya introduced time banking in her last campaign. And it caught people off guard a bit, I think, because of what you just said. It's kind of hard initially to go, wait a minute, what does that mean and how does that work and how do I benefit from it and all those things.
Yes.
But the idea that it was introduced at that level in the midst of a mayoral race, a mayoral campaign, kind of lends itself to the idea of the expansion of it. And before we go any deeper into the Kola Nut Collaborative, do you see time banking and as a foundation piece of mutual aid becoming a bigger thing in our city, particularly?
I absolutely do. I see time banking in general as being a gateway to a different form of relating to one another in community. And the way that I'll name that more specifically is that I was certainly here in the city for the round of mutual aid that happened in 2020 around COVID-19. And then I became more enmeshed in that process because I ended up, Kola Nut Collaborative became fiscally sponsored by Open Collective Foundation. I became acquainted with how they operated. I informed a number of mutual aid groups that were present in the city at that time about how they were operating. And, a large majority of the mutual aid groups that were present in the city, throughout that sort of period of 2020 to 2023 ended up being fiscally sponsored by Open Collective Foundation, and I ended up working there. So I had an opportunity to see both the rapid rise of mutual aid in the city, but I also happened to see, when there was a really deep decline in the way that people could solicit participation of people coming into service in the networks, right? So, folks, their volunteer capacity shrank, then mutual aid groups just kind of slowly teetered off, or they joined the Chicagoland Food Sovereignty Coalition. So I see the sort of rise and fall of the sort of active mobilization and volunteerism, and I'm trying to always think about ideas of how we can sustain the level of activity, the level of engagement, the level of relationship, and something like a time bank is the way to incentivize that type of participation in a sustained and ongoing basis.
Because it seems to me you can put everything under the umbrella of time banking, and where everybody benefits from it, and it's a reciprocal benefit. If as you mentioned the analogy about the teaching people how to ride a bike, yeah, you know what? I did that for you. How about this? I'm going to bank the rest of this time. I've got a mailbox that needs to be mounted.
There we go.
Or I've got a car that needs to be fixed. I'm kind of curious, not kind of either. I'm curious about how in this moment that we are in,
Yes.
where there is a lot of uncertainty economically, and we're watching the volatility of the stock market. Even folks who aren't familiar with the stock market are like, that's kind of odd that it goes from. I mean, I remember when the stock, as you do, I am sure, remember when the stock market was like 3,000 points. It's 33,000 points now.
Right.
So it's alarming when it drops anything. But again, I remember when it wasn't that high.
Right.
But in a moment of economic volatility, let's say that, not uncertainty, volatility.
Yes.
The idea that in Chicago, for example, you have Erica Allen's organization, the Chicago Food Depository. Food seems to be the main thing people hear when they in their head when they hear mutual aid, that folks need to eat. How do you go about with Kola Nut Collaborative getting people to understand it's not just food? Services are needed across the board. How do you relay that kind of message to people?
Yeah, so I think I like to think about it as a form of sort of first hyperlocal organizing and thinking about how that hyperlocal organizing scales up across multiple neighborhoods. So, I don't necessarily know what's needed in Jefferson Park. I don't know what's needed in Albany Park, right? I do know I know what's directly what's needed in Jeffrey Manor. I live there. I talk to my neighbors. I relate to my neighbors. I am interested in this idea that we could build hubs of time banking inside of neighborhoods, and then later we can get to this idea of how we can interconnect neighborhoods to one another so that like services can be traded between those neighborhoods. But that's, for me, like the sort of starting point of scaling up. And it's a similar approach to organizations, right? In the conversations that are going on with Urban Growers Collective right now, there's a very specific implementation and a specific need they have for time banking in their infrastructure that no other organization, namely like the early partnership that I had or the pilot was with Chicago Learning Exchange. And, they had a very specific, need for out-of-time youth-serving organizations, right? That's a different need. So being able to think about design as a sort of small design inside of an organization or a neighborhood that then can interconnect and interweave with other designs, and being able to not think about this idea that sometimes we approach, municipal problems or federal problems as like, it's a blanket. I'm going to lay this blanket over the whole city, and then it's going to be the thing, and that was actually my idea when I initially started the time bank. I was like, I just want a Chicago-wide time bank, and, it can be the same in every neighborhood. That's not true. Ultimately, just looking at the specific challenges of each neighborhood and trying to go through a process of helping neighborhoods design solutions that work for them is I think, how it scales time banking.
So I by my early years of life, 96 in Brennan. I'm from the Manor as well. Went to Llewellyn Elementary, all that cool stuff. I know that neighborhood pretty well. It is a very uniquely crafted neighborhood.
Yes.
That has different. Diverse is relative, I guess. Back then, it wasn't so diverse. It was very much. I think we were the third African American family in the Manor.
Yes.
That, of course, is mad different now. What are some of those things on the southeast side of Chicago that we may be missing in other areas, in other communities here in town that require need?
Yeah. So I'm going to flip the framing a bit, right? First, I'm going to just talk, because I believe in an asset-based frame, and I think that it's important to kind of point out what is there, right? Like, what is there? I moved to Jeffrey Manor in back in 2008. So, I bought my house at the peak of a different crash,
Indeed.
And so, but fortunately, I was very interested in the house, right? I was very interested in a home, in the neighborhood, in my community. And I ended up getting involved in the local organization, South Darien Manor Community Association, right? So Ishel Man, in getting involved, I saw how deep the networks are, how rich the stories are, how long the families have been there. And so people are very invested in the neighborhood as a site of tradition, as a site of history, and they can tell stories about Our Lady Gate of Heaven, and they can tell stories about all of the various elementary schools, and the school that's not there anymore. So that's what's there. There's history, there's stories. We got the best tree canopy in the city.
Yes,
arguably the neighbors, talk about. We also have the best public library in the city. Thank you, Lindsay Holbrook.
Yes,
and so all of those are things that are there, that are present. And the challenges, are many. I mean, I ride a bike, and the streets can be a rough ride, many a day, right? So there's streetscapes. There are elders who are aging in place who need different types of support, and they are right now basically having to use money to fund that support, and that may be challenging. They may not be able to improve upon their homes. They may not know sort of how to access all of the services they need. Some of the very same things that, I, through earshot and through relationship, hear spoken of by Rage and Inglewood, right? And so ultimately, I think that those are the things that when I'm engaging, I'm board governance advisor of the Manor Community Association. When I'm engaging with the Manor Community Association, what I'm trying to think through is how can we design programs that meet those needs, and then ultimately my trick bag is like, how can we bring time banking in here as a long-term solution for how we can sustain those programs, even if we don't necessarily know if our budget is going to expand as an association. This has been an unfunded or underfunded association for the last decade of its existence, right? But, there are other things, there are other ways that we've been able to strategize about how to do the things we can do without money. And I think that there are lots of organizations that could strategize through that if they were sort of pressed to a little bit of design thinking.
And what I also know about the Southeast side is that many, many years ago, way before the 2000s ever happened, when all the steel mills closed,
yes, it
kind of shut down that community a little bit. I'm a Chicago vocational alum.
Yes.
Chicago Vocational, Bowen, the schools in the Manor, that whole part of town that tends to get ignored,
yes,
unless something tragic happens and it's on the news. It is not the, and I don't know if it's because of the distance from the central part of the city, or just that people that's not front of mind, the southeast side of Chicago. And I'm asking this in relation to all of this stuff that we're going to talk about today about the Kola Nut Collaborative. How can you project what the southeast side of our city looks like in another 5, that we can't go past 10, in another 5 years?
Yeah. Well,
or is that even a fair question to ask?
I mean, it's a fair question to ask, and I'm going to, I can answer it as a member of the association, as an advisor to the association. I can answer it as just a person who's embedded as a resident in the community. It depends on who you ask. You will get, different answers depending upon if you've got an optimistic answer from Alderman Mitchell, right? Which, I can appreciate that perspective. We've got an answer from the Psi Quantum and the hospital that is being developed on the lakefront side. So it depends on who you ask, and that will be the perspective that you will get. When you talk to residents, that's it. The challenging question for residents is that the majority of sort of the generation that's in our association are elders. I'm a pretty young person, in the group, right? And so thinking out 10 years is sometimes a little bit of a mental sort of gap and a challenge. And then even if they have children and those children have moved on, like who's the next generation that takes over those homes? Who do those things pass on to? And right now we do have one of the tremendous problems, that we have specifically in the manor is this, international investors that are just kind of buying up housing stock and, don't have any care about sort of what the relationship is to the neighborhood. So, I think that on all of those fronts, it's always an organizing challenge, right? Whether we're trying to figure out how to integrate people, and I don't believe in that debate between sort of renter and homeowner, right? Whether we're trying to integrate people who are renting into the fabric of community or whether we're trying to, instigate new forms of home ownership, diverse forms of housing cooperatives or community land trust, whatever we're trying to do, I think it's an organizing challenge. And so that's what helps me to give perspective. I know that in a decade, I'll have grandbabies. My grandbabies will be, 11 and 12 at that point, right?
Right.
And so I am thinking, for the future of those parts of Chicago, those young people and what I actually want them to inherit, what type of city I want them to have access to, and how can I design systems and design spaces that will actually ensure that they have a shot at something different.
We'll be taking a break soon. On the other side of that break, I do want to talk about what that looks like, too,
Yes.
the ideas that you may have about how our city and the young people who are coming up, what will they be inheriting from us? And of course, we're going to continue to talk about the Kola Nut Collaborative. I am intrigued, though, because, again, being a South Sider and having roots in that neighborhood particularly, I was always amazed. You mentioned the library. First library card I ever got is from the library. One of the best libraries in the city, easy.
Yes.
I was always amazed with the functionality of that neighborhood, and I imagine it was because a lot of those folks who lived there back in the day worked at the mill, and that everything you wanted was there. There was entertainment, there was food, there was everything. You didn't have to leave. It's kind of like Pullman. You didn't have to leave the neighborhood to get whatever you wanted. That all changed. I don't know if we see signs of that returning, that self-sufficiency for our communities. There's 77 great communities in our city, and I think most of them would argue that they have to go outside of their community to be able to get the services that they need. Do you see the time banking aspect of what you do a way to connect those particular communities where they can become a little bit more self-sufficient through the time banking initiative?
Yeah, and I think I'll connect this to this idea that you posted the publication as a part of the promo about the sort of how to design public services through time banking, right? And so for me, time banking is a continuous process of both asset mapping and needs definition, right? And so this is something that, if you have a robust neighborhood association, it ideally should be serving this function anyway. When we do our sort of, end of year wrap up and we start to do our victory chart and figure out what goals we've actually met throughout the year and what things we want to aspire to in the coming year, what we're doing is we're trying to say, what is our vision of this community that we would actually aspire for it to become? And then if we can map backwards, what are the steps we need to take to get there? And so I see signs of that in the quality of life plan process that's happening currently in South Chicago through Claretian. We certainly participated in a focus group, even though we're not directly in the South Chicago neighborhood proper. But ultimately, that is also an avenue for us to be able to vision with our residents and with our community. What do you want the 95th Street corridor to look like, and how can we communicate that to the aldermen and communicate that to Terrico and the folks who own both sides of those commercial spaces in the corridor, and then ultimately, but it's a continuous process of just getting people into the vision of what will this community look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and how can we make sure that we position ourselves to ask for the right things to get us incrementally there over time?
I have had this conversation with a couple of the boards that I sit on, a couple of organizations I sit on with the boards about the need to be more collaborative with organizations. It's not a competitive situation, and we got to stop looking at it as competition and look at it more as how can we benefit from stitching these things together so that we all can survive in whatever this is that we are in. And I see that with the city, there's clearly a subversive attempt to keep this as segregated as possible, economically especially, and through that, everything suffers when one area has more than the other. Everything in the other areas suffers. At some point, that has to change. I don't know if it's in our lifetime. I hope so, because I'd like to have a victory lap. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But how do we accelerate that change? And that'll be my last question before we go to break. How do we accelerate this change in our philosophy about why it's important for us to collaborate and to make this better for the folks who live in these underserved communities?
Okay, and I'm gonna scan back a little bit and think about the levers of change, right? So one of the levers of change that I worked on, probably 4 years ago, I think it was at this point, but it was the Independent Advisory Redistricting Commission out of Change, Illinois, and what was the aspiration of that commission, right? We think that gerrymandering is fundamentally unjust and unfair, right? And so we don't necessarily think that maps should be drawn in the back room of city council. I recognize, and certainly we recognize as a commission that we are fundamentally disagree on that with the city council, and they fought us on it, right? So we built a map by going to all of these communities and trying to understand what's the actual physical geography, what are the sort of cultural lines and cultural landscapes, and how can we draw more compact maps so that we don't necessarily have neighborhoods competing against one another. In the 7th Ward, Mitchell has 4 different neighborhoods that have 4 different sets of needs, and it's fundamentally set up for them to contend with one another for his time and the resources that come to the ward. And so ultimately, those are for me, those are like small levers of change. Well, not actually small, but those are great levers of change. So there's that lever, but it's something that also shows up inside of the community development organizations where they think that also that they own a region, and they need to contest for resources that come to that region. So when anyone's going to write a grant for X neighborhood, they're going to say, look at us as the place to do it. And for me, I think that we could move beyond that as organizations, and communities should advocate for that in the organizations they are part of.
We are talking with Michael Strode from the Kola Nut Collaborative here on the Mutual Aid Report. This is WLPN-LP Chicago, 105.5 FM Lumpen Radio, lumpenradio.com, and lumpen.tv. We're going to take a break. When we come back, Mike, I want to talk about time banking during the Trump administration, among other things. I also want to go over the tenets of Kola Nut Collaborative, because there's some very interesting tenets in place that I think not just here in the city, but organizations around the country could benefit from taking a small peek at what the Kola Nut Collaborative is doing. In doing the research for today, I was taken aback at just how much leverage we really have when we operate together.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? When we can go, you know what? I know a guy that fixes shoes, and I know he has an elderly mom who needs food. Why don't we figure that out? And that's essentially what we have been talking about so far. Although we have talked about a lot of things, we will get deeper into the Kola Nut Collaborative in a moment. Thank you so much for listening to the program. By the way, if you'd like more information about Kola Nut Collaborative, go to Kola, that's with a K, Kola, Nut Collab, COLAB.org. That's kolanutcollab.org. More with Mike Strode when we come back. This is WLPN-LP Chicago, 105.5 FM, Lumpen Radio, and we will be back right after these words. Welcome back to the Mutual Aid Report here on WLPN-LP Chicago, 105.5 FM, Lumpen Radio, and lumpenradio.com. lumpenradio.com, and also you can watch the show on lumpen.tv. We're with Michael Strode from the Kola Nut Collaborative. If you want more information about the Kola Nut Collaborative, how you can help out or how you can benefit from it, it's Kola Nut, Kola with a K, Kola Nut Collab, COLLAB.org. That's KOLANUTCOLLAB.org. How will the Kola Nut Collaborative operate is not the word. How will the Kola Nut Collaborative be a part of whatever this is within the Trump administration, and how people will manage to survive all of these things that are happening?
Okay. Well, so I'll start by just saying that the Kola Nut Collaborative is, for me, and I'll start maybe from the history of when I discovered time banking, mm-hmm. and what I found so compelling about the Cowrie Collective as a time bank. Kola Nut Collaborative is not just altruism. It's not just volunteering. And, I don't necessarily, I don't think those things are terrible things. I just don't think that those things are systemic changes or transformative change. And so the Kola Nut Collaborative advocates for a broader transformative change in the economics and governance of society. And so that in that vision, we call the solidarity economy, and that is certainly something that is espoused by U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, where I serve on the board, New Economy Coalition, where I serve on the board. And so this is an idea that communities should have a say in the sort of collective governance of the things that infect their lives, whether those are sort of, the economic dimensions or the economic decisions that affect their lives, or the political and governance decisions that affect their lives. And so that in that realm, Kola Nut is meant to be a project that is always trying to keep its finger on the pulse of what communities need in terms of how they want their lives to look different. And that might sometimes mean being in political contestation with whomever is in government, right? Mm-hmm. At the city level, at the state level, at the federal level. But it might also mean, being it might also mean figuring out what the realm of partnership is, what the realm of collaboration is. But at all times, we're looking at democracy, participatory democracy specifically, as the fundamental core in which people are able to participate in all aspects of their lives, and they're not being, sort of led along by either a corporation or an elected official. So the Kola Nut Collaborative, for me, participates in that level. And while my engagement with things like the Advisory Redistricting Commission was an independent effort, it is part of my overall thinking about how time banking is connected to these different strategies.
One of the things that is on your website that I have up that I'm sure you've looked at like 5 times already. Like, what is this? It's a statement, and it says the value of our currency and what our currency values are 2 distinctly different ideas.
Yes.
Expound.
Yeah. So this is connected to this idea of the Kola Nut as a symbol that has both value and values, right? And also it's connected to a phrase that I have heard uttered many a time by Tavis Smiley, and I think quoting Martin Luther King, but budgets are moral documents, right? So the way that a society invests its money, invests its capital, says something about what that society values. And ultimately, I think I can connect that then to the sort of the 5 core values of time banking as espoused initially by Edgar Kahn in a book on time dollars, right? Mm-hmm. And it was this idea of asset mapping, right? So every person is an asset, like everyone has something to offer. Redefining work, so this idea that that all forms of work are valuable, and oftentimes the way that our society values work, somebody's got 3x and somebody's got 1x, right? But redefining work says that all forms of work are valuable. And if somebody didn't come one day and empty all those cans in your neighborhood, how would you feel? What would you do with your life, right?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so ultimately just recognizing all of these different forms of care work, care labor, societal labor, are important. Reciprocity. So we give to communities that will support us in receiving. So this idea that that reciprocity is a healthy thing for being able to ensure that people, 1, feel like they are fully included and they are contributors to society, but also that, if they are in need, they can reach out and ask for what they need. The power of social networks. So this idea that, we are trying to strengthen our efforts by combining the different networks. And then finally, that fifth value is around everybody being deserving of respect and belonging and inclusion, right? So, we want to make sure that everybody feels included. And it's those 5 core values around time banking that are meant to heighten the idea that when we are building a time bank, we're engaged in an economic project, we're engaged in a social movement project, we're engaged in a political and a governance project, and all of those things are happening at the same time.
You talk about one of the things that you mentioned, or that is available for folks to see on your website, is the Time Salon. Mm-hmm. What is the concept of the Time Salon, and how does that work, and how can people activate that?
Absolutely. So a time salon is just, my novel way of just describing, look, a time banking orientation. But I don't want to call it a time banking 101. I don't want to call it an orientation. Right. But it is. There are certainly facilitation mechanisms, and one, facilitation is a really key part of this process here. But there are different facilitation techniques that you can use to get people engaged in this idea beyond just explaining time banking, right? Because, hey, in fact, I'll try it here, right? When you explain time banking, it's really challenging for the mind. Right. But when you give people an actual experience of banking of how a time bank might work, it's a little bit easier to understand. So if I were to ask you about what you have to offer, and I would say, what's something people always ask you about?
Coming on the show so they could talk about their service or event.
Okay. And so you have a knowledge of radio, you have a knowledge of broadcasting, and that's something that you could share. Even if you don't necessarily want to give them a spot on the show, you could talk to them about, how to operate a radio show. Mm-hmm. Boom. There's an offer, right? Mm-hmm. And then, inside of a time salon, we might go through a process of saying, when would you be available to offer that thing? Is that something that's available all the time? Is it location specific, or can you do it virtually? And then finally, what cost would you assign to that? Are you willing to give it away for free? Are you willing to trade it for time bank currencies? And then similarly, there's another process, and this comes from a framework called the Offers and Needs Market that was developed by Post-Growth Institute. There's another framework around the needs market. And so what is a problem that you need the support of other people to resolve?
Ooh, there's so many. Transportation.
Okay.
Instead of drive sharing with the drive share industries that are available, and not to go to super deep into the jitney world, but transportation, the ability to be able to get from my house to wherever I need to go to do the things I need to do.
Absolutely. So you're interested in being able to car share, and then we would go through a process of thinking about how urgent is that need for you? Mm-hmm. Is that need location specific? And then finally, what is a payment you would be willing to render for someone to support you with that need? Is it something you would be willing to do or you're seeking to do in time? And so this is just a practice of getting people into their body, because oftentimes when you go into a time bank, the first thing a time bank is going to offer you, the platform that is what do you have to offer and what do you need? And then when people encounter those questions, it's so daunting because no one has ever asked about that. You right. Go to work and they say, we will give you $10 an hour for X service. Are you willing to take $10 an hour? And you're just like, well, I guess.
Yeah.
But if they asked you, what do you need to live? What do you need to thrive, right? Then that's a different question and that's a different approach. And time banking is really about giving people an opportunity to consent into the world that they need to thrive and to ask for the big things, but also to offer all of those little things that, they didn't know were worthwhile. Three keys on a piano, 2 strings on a guitar. Can you teach me a song with two guitar strings? If you can, you got something to offer.
Right.
And, oftentimes I've been in situations where I'm doing these workshops with elders and they're like, well, I'm older and I can't move around a lot. And I'm like, you got some brilliant stories. You got some history that somebody need to know.
Yeah.
You have some possibility of companionship, if you want to sit with someone so there's all these things that we don't think of as valuable, redefining work, that we could value if we had a time bank as a different form of economic exchange in our community.
And within that, we're talking about redefining the traditional mutual aid narrative. It's not just it is all of those things, but it's not just that. It's also the smaller things that folks may need.
Yeah.
One of the other tenets of this is leveraging cooperatives for affordable housing, and you refer to it on your website, the Solutions Land and Housing Toolkit. Can you explain that to me a little bit?
Yeah, so this connects to this idea that the Kola Nut Collaborative is not, it is a time banking effort. Like the main function and work of the Kola Nut Collaborative is time banking. But the broader sort of political project that I'm very interested in and that I'm involved in is around this idea of solidarity economy. And so that connects to us being able to transform the landscape of a city, of a society by collectivizing resources, right? So, that land and housing toolkit talks about housing cooperatives, which we do have housing cooperatives in the city. And that's a type of housing that is owned by a group of people that make collective decisions about how to manage that housing, right? So, one of the sort of examples that I'm in relationship with is called Jumpstart Housing Cooperative, owned by, folks who have a lived experience of incarceration, who are also, have helped to form Shy Fresh Kitchen, and ultimately, people who were one of the most impacted with coming out into society and trying to figure out where to live, right? And ultimately, to be able to have a type of housing, a form of shared housing that allows them to make decisions about, hey, what sort of, how late can I arrive? What's the sort of conditions of the property? What the common areas look like? Those are important pieces. And so the Kola Nut Collaborative is very interested in helping people get these ideas off the ground or connect to people who can support them with getting the ideas off the ground.
And then another thing that you talk about that I'm also very interested in, people-powered money, designing, developing, and delivering community currencies. That's what I believe you were talking about earlier, just the idea of what do you have to offer and how do you translate that to what you may need too.
Yeah. So time banking is one. So there's this broader idea of a thing called complementary currencies, and time banking is one form of complementary currency. A complementary currency is just a society has one form of financial exchange, some sort of dollar that they use, and there could be other complementary currencies that could be a little bit more accessible and a little bit more usable by more people in society if we had them, if we supported them. So a time banking is one form of complementary currency, specifically around how we use an hour of our time to exchange. But we could develop other forms of currency, and I'm not even going into the sort of cryptocurrency space. That's on the side there. But just there are other forms of exchange and other forms of currency that have been tried. And the People Powered Money publication talks a little bit about different currency experiments, especially around Europe. There are a few in the U.S. like Ithaca Hours and things like that, but there are not many that have been survived here, very long.
What do you see the future of Kola Nut Collaborative, and the subtext of that is how people are able to help Kola Nut Collaborative out, and how if they need help from the collaborative, how do they get it?
Yeah, the future of Kola Nut Collaborative is as an incubation space for these ideas. When I was originally exploring the ideas around time banking, there just wasn't a space to figure out how to test and pilot these types of experiments. And so, I participated in building one, right? And I built one for a specific purpose within the Healthy Food Hub, but then I saw that it had other applications outside of the Healthy Food Hub. And so this is a design space for these types of ideas to flourish and thrive. And ultimately, the current course and the sort of near future course for the Kola Nut Collaborative is working with organizations to pilot time banking experiments inside of their organizations, institutions, neighborhood associations. And so, right now there's Urban Growers Collective, certainly my home organization of Manor Community Association, and I'm reaching out to other organizations on the Southeast side to figure out if we can get a time banking pilot off the ground in their area to see if it might solve some of the problems that they are experiencing in their community. And ultimately, at some point, I hope that there is a decentralized network of time banks in every single neighborhood. I don't have to touch them. I don't have to go facilitate at them, but people have the skills that they need to facilitate their own offers and needs markets, to facilitate their own time salons, and maybe I just come in to help them mediate the platform or try to figure out what platform they'll be using for it.
And I think that that's probably the most interesting aspect of all of this, considering we have 77 communities in our city, some in far better shape than others, but still needing assistance in many ways. And the idea of of the expansion of thought when it comes to time banking is fascinating, because if this was a model that worked, it really would help so many different people on so many levels, because it's an undeniable thing. If you offer a service and you have something to offer to reciprocate that, or the person you're helping has something to offer to reciprocate that, that's amazing. That's everything we've been saying we wanted. We just didn't know the name of it was time banking. But that's fascinating, man. I am also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you in particular, and all of the things that you do and have done, have been steadfast in trying to make sure that there are people who need services and help, that they are aided. The work that you guys did on the map. So we were here. And Alan Linton is a mutual friend of ours.
Ah, yes.
That's my man. We were here, and I'm like, it seems so simple that would work.
Yes.
There's no way in the world people would be against something like that.
Yes.
And it turns out that there were people who were against it, namely folks on the city council who aren't there anymore.
Yes.
Do you find that there's resistance to this idea of time banking? Are people like saying, wait a minute, that sounds crazy. We can't actually do something like help people. That's wild.
I don't find that there's necessarily resistance to time banking in that way. I find that even people who are used to working on complex problems, can't wrap their head around the idea that this is something that they can implement or that they want to spend time on implementing. So there's a little bit more skepticism and hesitation than there is resistance. And so I just continue kind of being steadfast and just, mapping how these experiments are happening in the U.S., mapping how they happen throughout the world. Certainly the publication, The New Wealth of Time, comes from the UK, where, time banking has actually been embedded in local councils. It's just very common that it's embedded in local councils and youth programs. There are national time banking efforts. And, I've just in my world and in my body, made a personal commitment to, one, staying in the practice of trying to figure out how this can apply here, and then also trying to support the local or the national time banking entity in the U.S., timebanks.org, with embedding themselves in the broader fabric of social movement, because everywhere that I go in social movement and I introduce something like the offers and needs market, they're like, wow, I didn't know I needed this. I didn't know this was something that was going to be useful. And even, March 22nd, back in, 2 weeks ago, right? I hosted something called the Shaping Change Facilitator Festival. And that Shaping Change Facilitator Festival was one of the sort of, maybe largest OANMs that has happened in Chicago, offers and needs market, that has happened in Chicago to date. And, the 60 people who came to that session that did the 2-hour offers and needs market, that, witnessed the keynote conversation between myself and Tony Anderson, that participated in the sort of unstructured networking that happened later over, a platter of arepas from BN Misabi and things like that, right? It was sheer hospitality. It was sheer goodwill, radical hospitality, radical welcoming, respect, belonging, and inclusion. And everybody that came out of there said that they had experiences in their body where they were like, wow, like I wish I could feel like this more often. And ultimately for me, that's what the sort of transformative potential of time banking is about. I would love if, people got on the platform and did things like that. But more often, I want people to have an experience where they feel like they can voice the things that they can contribute to society, the things that they need from society and their neighborhood and their community, and then feel like they actually have the possibility of receiving the things that they've asked for.
Okay. I live, for example, let's say, pick a neighborhood, Mario, you've lived in. I live in South Shore. I'm interested in organizing my community. I'm on a couple of different organizations in South Shore, but I'm curious as to how I can turn these folks on to the concept of time banking and what the Kola Nut Collaborative has done on the Southeast side. How do I go about doing that, and how can I create or can I collaborate with you to create this time banking situation for South Shore?
Absolutely. So you can visit the website, kolanutcollab.org, KOLANUTCOLLAB.org. And you can email me, connect@kolanutcollab.org. I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to implement time banking. The way that I advise other time banks nationally that are trying to get off the ground, when people have reached out to me and asked, I'm like, hey, the first thing you should start with is an offers and needs market. First, just facilitate getting a group of people in a room, doing an offers and needs market, and seeing if that works, right? Mm-hmm. If that part works, if that part sparks in some excitement and some joy in people's bodies, then you can say, well, you've already done some mapping right here in this room. Put the map online. Just, here's a platform. And if people want to use the Kola Nut Collaborative's existing platform, you can get to it through the website. You can certainly go there to the membership page on kolanutcollab.org, and you can join the time bank immediately. There is no cost associated with the time bank. Fortunately, we are in a new relationship with a different platform that has made that much more possible. And so you can join the time bank right now. You can reach out if you want to facilitate a time salon or an offers and needs market in your community. And ultimately, once you have the tools, once you have the skills, I'm gonna move my hands back and I'm gonna say, run down the field with them.
Right. Hey, listen. So for full disclosure, there's a group of people who are listening to this who probably know your name but don't know you. If you have been to any decent party in the last 15 years in Chicago, you've seen my man dancing at a party. You got your drum in your bag?
I don't have it today.
Oh, now that is a shock.
Yes. I got a whistle in the pouch, though.
There you go. There it is. I really appreciate you being on the show, man. I cannot tell you how invaluable this information, and how many people are going to benefit from it. Thank you for lending your time. And I know you're a busy dude. You're probably going off to talk to some more people about something. But I truly, truly appreciate this, Mike. Thank you, man, for being on the show today.
I appreciate you bringing the invitation, Mario. And I look forward to folks who want to connect. And it's been a joy.
Nick Wiley is the reason why this happened.
All
Nick
right.
goes, hey man, do you know? I'm like, yes. What? Of course I do. Thanks again, man. I really, really appreciate you being on today. And thank you, everybody, for listening to the show. This program today, this Mutual Aid Report, you will be able to see, or hear rather, a new one in a couple of weeks. We're on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month. Thank you to Charlie Garcia, Stephanie Mariquez. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the program. Really appreciate your patronage. Hope to see you again in a couple of weeks. This is WLPN-LP Chicago, 105.5 FM Lumpen Radio, and you have listened to the Mutual Aid Report.